Winter 1857. A man sells firewood in the streets of St. Louis to carry his family through the cold. His army career is behind him. His future is a blank page. 8 years later, that same man will accept the surrender of the largest army ever to lay down its arms on American soil. His name is Ulysses S. Grant. He did not want to be a soldier. At West Point, he was an unremarkable student who cared little for drill or discipline and excelled at almost nothing except mathematics and horsemanship, where he set a high jump record on horseback that stood for years after he left. He read novels when he should have studied tactics. He graduated in 1843, in the middle of his class, and his private hope was not glory, but a quiet post teaching mathematics at some college. The war he had been trained for arrived instead. In the war with Mexico, from 1846 to 1848, Grant served as a young regimental quartermaster and saw combat under both Zachary Taylor and Winfield Scott. He learned the machinery of war from the inside, how an army is fed and supplied, how it moves across hostile country, how it wins, and how it comes apart. At Monterey, he volunteered to ride through sniper-swept streets, clinging to the side of his horse to carry a message for ammunition. He marched with Scott's army all the way to Mexico City, and he came away convinced that the war itself was unjust, a war of conquest forced by a strong republic on a weaker neighbor. He wrote long afterward that he considered it one of the most wicked wars ever waged. He had fought in it regardless, and fought well, and he never forgot the lesson buried in that contradiction, that a soldier can serve with courage in a cause he privately condemns. After the fighting came the years that nearly erased him. He married Julia Dent, the sister of a West Point roommate, and he loved her without reservation for the rest of his life. But the peacetime army sent him to remote and lonely posts on the Pacific coast, first in the Oregon Territory and then in California, hundreds of miles and many months from Julia and their small children. Isolated, homesick, and short of money, he drank to fill the emptiness. In 1854, still a captain, he resigned from the army abruptly, under circumstances that were never fully documented, and the rumors about the reason trailed him for the rest of his days. What followed was failure stacked upon failure. He tried to farm a plot of family land near St. Louis, cleared the trees himself, built a rough house with his own hands, and named the place, without a trace of irony, Hardscrabble. The farm failed. He tried selling real estate and collecting rents and debts in the city, and failed at that too soft-hearted to press the people who owed money. In the winter of 1857, he pawned his gold watch to buy Christmas presents for his family. He hauled and sold firewood on the streets, a West Point graduate and former captain in a faded army coat, and men who had known him in better days crossed to the other side of the street. By 1860, he had abandoned the idea of independence entirely and gone to work as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Galena, Illinois, sorting hides and keeping accounts under the supervision of his own younger brothers. He was 38 years old, and by every visible measure, he was a broken and defeated man. There was a strange contradiction at the center of the man that the coming war would expose. This general, who would preside over the bloodiest battles in American history, was, in private life, unusually gentle and quiet. He detested cruelty to animals and could not bear to see a horse mistreated. He refused to hunt. He disliked the sight of blood so much that he would eat meat only when it was cooked almost black. He rarely raised his voice, told no coarse stories, and struck most who met him as a modest, plain, unimpressive figure. Nothing about him announced the resolve that lay underneath. Then, in April of 1861, Confederate guns opened fire on Fort Sumter, and the United States tore itself in two. The war remade Grant exactly as it remade the country. He was one of the very few men in Galena who had actually commanded soldiers, and when the town raised a company of volunteers, he drilled them and escorted them to the state capitol at Springfield. Within months, the failed store clerk had been made a colonel, and then a brigadier general of volunteers. He was posted to the Western Theater, the enormous, contested country drained by the Tennessee, the Cumberland, and the Mississippi rivers. And there, In that first grim year of Union defeats, he did the one thing almost no other Northern general would do. He went forward. He attacked. In February 1862, he moved against two Confederate forts guarding the river approaches to the south, Fort Henry and Fort Donelson. Henry fell quickly to the Union gunboats. At Donelson, in bitter, freezing weather, Grant closed a ring around the garrison and held on when a breakout nearly succeeded. When the trapped Confederate commander asked what terms he might expect, Grant sent back a single hard sentence. No terms except an unconditional and immediate surrender could be accepted. The fort gave up with some 15,000 men, the largest capture of an army on the continent at that time. It was the first great Union victory of the war, and a desperate Northern public seized on the initials of his name and his reply. U.S. Grant became Unconditional Surrender Grant. For the first time in his life, Ulysses Grant was famous. Fame brought scrutiny, and scrutiny very nearly destroyed him. In April 1862, at a country meeting house in Tennessee called Shiloh, a Confederate army crashed into Grant's camps at dawn and came within an afternoon of driving his men into the Tennessee River. The first day was a chaos of surprise and slaughter. Grant held on through a night of drenching rain, refused to consider retreat, brought his reinforcements across the river in the dark, and counterattacked at first light to retake the field. But the scale of the killing horrified the nation. More Americans fell in those 2 days at Shiloh than in all the country's earlier wars put together. Newspapers denounced Grant as a butcher and revived the whispers that he was a drunkard and demanded that Lincoln remove him. According to the account that spread afterward, when the president's advisors pressed him to do exactly that, Lincoln answered that he could not spare this man because this man fought. It is here, in the very middle of his rise, that the record turns dark, and honesty demands that it be told plainly rather than skipped. In December 1862, worn down by the black market in Southern cotton that swarmed after his army, and stung by the discovery that his own father had quietly joined a cotton trading scheme with Jewish business partners, Grant issued General Order No. 11. In a single sentence, it expelled all Jews, as a class, from the entire military district under his command, an area covering parts of Tennessee, Mississippi, and Kentucky, and it gave them 24 hours to leave. It was the most sweeping official act of anti-Semitism in the history of the United States. In Paducah, Kentucky, 30 Jewish families, some of them long-settled residents of the town, at least 2 of them Union Army veterans, were ordered from their homes. One of them, a merchant named Caesar Caskell, refused to accept it in silence and carried his protest by train all the way to Washington and into the presence of the president himself. Lincoln, once he grasped what the order actually said, had it revoked within weeks. To condemn a class, the president said, was to wrong the good along with the bad. Grant never publicly defended the order again. In later years, he expressed genuine regret for it, and as president, he would appoint more Jewish Americans to public office than any president before him. But the order had been real. Its victims had been real, and no later act of conscience ever wholly erased it. Through all of it, Grant kept driving toward the single prize that would decide the war in the West, Vicksburg, the fortress city set on high bluffs above the Mississippi, the last great stronghold binding the two halves of the Confederacy together. For months he tried to reach it and failed, through swamps and floods and failed canals. Then he gambled everything on a single audacious plan. He cut loose from his own base of supply, marched his army down the far bank, crossed the great river below the city, and plunged inland into the state of Mississippi, feeding his men off the countryside. In a lightning campaign, he won 5 battles in under 3 weeks, at Port Gibson, at Raymond, at Jackson, at Champion Hill, and drove the Confederate army back inside the Vicksburg defenses. Then he laid siege. On the 4th of July, 1863, starved out, the city and its army of some 30,000 men surrendered. The Confederacy was cut in two. The Mississippi flowed unbroken to the sea under Union control, and on that very same day, far to the east, Lee's great invasion of the North was shattered at Gettysburg. The war had reached its hinge, and Grant had swung half of it himself. That autumn, Lincoln handed him command of the whole Western War, and Grant hurried to Chattanooga, where a Union army lay half-starved and besieged after a defeat at Chickamauga. He opened a supply line, brought up reinforcements, and in November 1863 sent his men storming up the slopes of Missionary Ridge in an assault that swept the Confederates off the heights and lifted the siege. The gateway to the Deep South stood open, and Grant's name now stood above every other in the Union armies. Now Lincoln reached out and took hold of him. In March 1864, Grant was made a lieutenant general, a rank that before him only George Washington had truly held, and given command of every army of the United States. He came east to confront Robert E. Lee directly, and he brought with him a hard philosophy that the string of cautious Eastern generals before him had never been able to sustain. He would not fight one bloody battle and then retreat for months to refit. He would take Lee by the throat and refuse to let go, whatever the price, until the Confederate army was destroyed. The price was appalling. Through the spring and summer of 1864, in the blind, tangled woods of the wilderness, in the trenches of Spotsylvania, on the killing ground of Cold Harbor, the two armies tore at each other in weeks of nearly continuous combat, unlike anything the war had produced before. In the wilderness, the forest itself caught fire around the wounded. At Spotsylvania, pinned down and pressed to pull back, Grant sent word that he proposed to fight it out on that line if it took all summer. At Cold Harbor, he ordered a headlong frontal assault that was cut to pieces in a matter of minutes, an attack he later admitted was the one he most regretted ordering in the entire war. The lengthening casualty lists darkened doorways all across the North, and the old cry rose again: "Butcher Grant." The charge deserves a careful answer rather than a slogan. Grant's armies did suffer enormous losses in that campaign, greater in raw numbers than Lee's, but he was the one attacking, throwing himself against an entrenched enemy defending the ground before its own capital, which is the hardest and costliest task in all of warfare. Lee's smaller army was bled in proportion just as severely, and unlike Grant, Lee could not replace the men he lost. Grant grasped the brutal arithmetic that the rest of the North was slow to accept, that the Union could endure and refill losses that the Confederacy could not. It was grim, and there was nothing glorious in it, but it was the strategy that finally ended the war, and it is a distortion of history to reduce it to mere butchery. To this stretch of the war belongs one of the strangest twists in the whole story of Grant's public image. The single most famous photograph of the general, mounted on horseback before his troops at his City Point headquarters in Virginia, is a fake. It was stitched together around 1902 by a photographer named Levin Handy, a nephew of the great war photographer Matthew Brady, out of three entirely separate images. Grant's head lifted from a portrait made at Cold Harbor, the body and the horse taken from a photograph of a completely different general named McCook, and a background of Confederate prisoners who had been captured hundreds of miles away and had never laid eyes on Grant. The clues are there for a careful viewer. The rank shown on the shoulder is wrong for the moment. The horse is not one Grant is known to have ridden. The seams betray the joints. For most of a century, the composite passed as a genuine record until researchers at the Library of Congress finally took it apart and exposed it. It stands as an almost too perfect emblem for a man whose real record was so persistently buried beneath invented pictures. The end in Virginia came in the spring of 1865. Grant's long siege of Petersburg at last broke through Lee's thinning lines. Richmond fell, and the Confederate army streamed westward, starving, exhausted, and surrounded on every side. On the 9th of April, in the front parlor of a private farmhouse at a crossroads called Appomattox Courthouse, Lee surrendered. And Grant, the man who 3 years before had demanded unconditional surrender, now offered terms of striking generosity. The Confederate soldiers would lay down their weapons and simply go home, unmolested, and the men who owned horses could keep them for the spring planting. When Grant's own troops began firing celebratory salutes, he ordered them stopped at once. The war was over, he said. The men across the field were their countrymen once more, and he would not have them humiliated. It was, by his own reckoning, the finest hour of his life, and it was an act not of triumph, but of mercy. The soldier had won the war. Now the nation asked the soldier to govern it, and the second half of his story is far harder to weigh than the first. In the bitter years just after the war, Grant broke with President Andrew Johnson over the fate of the defeated South and the freedom of the formerly enslaved. In 1868, running on the simple promise, "Let us have peace," he was elected President of the United States, the youngest man to reach the office up to that time. He inherited a South convulsed by the struggle over Reconstruction, the fight over whether the 4 million people freed by the war would become citizens in truth or only in law. And here, as president, Grant answered his own darkest hour with the finest public work of his life. Across the beaten South, a secret terror had risen. The Ku Klux Klan, bands of masked night riders who whipped, burned, tortured, and murdered to drive black citizens away from the ballot box and to topple the elected Reconstruction governments of the southern states. Local sheriffs and courts would not or could not stop them. Often they were part of it. Grant went to Congress and asked for the power to act, and Congress passed a series of enforcement acts, the last and strongest of them known as the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. Grant had already pressed for the creation of a brand new Department of Justice to enforce the law across the whole country. He placed it in the hands of an attorney general named Emus Ackerman, a Georgian and former Confederate officer who would become one of the most determined defenders of the freedmen in the government. In the autumn of 1871, in 9 counties of upcountry South Carolina where the Klan ruled almost unchecked, Grant suspended the writ of habeas corpus and sent in federal troops and United States Marshals under a hard-driving officer named Lewis Merrill. Hundreds of Klansmen were arrested, and hundreds more fled the state. Thousands were indicted across the South, and many hundreds convicted in federal courtrooms where the juries were frequently majority black. The first Klan was broken, and it would not rise again in real strength for 2 generations. No president for 100 years afterward would use the power of the federal government so aggressively to protect the rights of black Americans. The same man who in 1862 had expelled a people as a class had become, as president, the man who threw the whole weight of the state between the Klan and its intended victims. That is the light of his presidency. The shadow across it is that his administration became a national byword for corruption. A conspiracy to corner the market in gold sent a financial shock through the country in 1869. His second term was hammered by one scandal after another, among them the whiskey ring that defrauded the government of liquor taxes, and a bribery affair that reached into his own cabinet and touched his private secretary. Grant himself was never shown to have taken a dishonest dollar. His weakness was a trusting, stubborn loyalty to men who did not deserve it, an inability to believe that people he counted as friends could be lying to his face. He was an honest man, surrounded by dishonest ones, and the distance between those two facts is very nearly the whole tragedy of his presidency. Weighed against the scandals stood one genuine triumph abroad, the peaceful settlement with Britain of the dangerous Alabama claims, the dispute over British-built Confederate raiders, achieved through patient diplomacy and counted among the great treaties of the century. But the will behind that work did not last. As the years passed, a weary North lost its appetite for troops and trials in the South. Northern newspapers complained of bayonet rule, and Grant himself, late in his second term, grew more cautious about intervening. The protections he had fought for began to erode even before he left office, and the world of the freedmen he had defended would soon be abandoned to a long darkness. It is one of the sorrows of his presidency that he saw the tide begin to turn and could not hold it back. He left the White House in 1877, and the world he had helped to reshape now received him as a conquering hero. He and Julia set out on what became a tour around the entire globe, and everywhere they went, enormous crowds turned out to see them. In Berlin, he sat and talked of war, as one professional to another, with Otto von Bismarck. He was received by Queen Victoria in England, and by the rulers of Egypt, India, China, and Japan. The failed clerk from the leather store in Galena had become, for a time, the most celebrated American alive on the earth. And then, one final time, he lost everything he had. In 1884, Grant placed his money, and worse, his trusted name, into a Wall Street investment house run by a young financier named Ferdinand Ward, a man the newspapers called the young Napoleon of finance. Ward was a swindler, running an enormous fraud. The firm collapsed, and Grant, at 62 years old, was left ruined, humiliated, and poorer than he had been on the day he sold firewood in the streets. Almost in the same terrible season, his doctors told him that the constant soreness in his throat was cancer, the harvest of a lifetime of cigars, and that it would kill him. What Grant did in the last year of his life is the reason his story does not end in that defeat. To provide for Julia after he was gone, he sat down to write his memoirs of the war. His friend Mark Twain arranged to publish them on terms of extraordinary generosity. And Grant, in constant and worsening pain, his voice fading to a whisper and then to nothing, wrapped in blankets on the porch of a borrowed cottage on a mountainside in New York, wrote against the advancing clock. He completed the manuscript only a few days before he died, on the 23rd of July, 1885. The memoirs proved to be a masterpiece, plain, honest, clear, and unsparing, admired ever since as one of the finest works of their kind in the English language, and they became one of the great bestsellers of the age. They earned his widow a fortune and secured at last the family he had failed and worried over so many times before. He wrote it himself, every word, refusing to let anyone polish it for him, and the plainness was its greatness. No boasting, no excuses, a soldier setting down what he had seen and done in clear, unhurried prose. Mark Twain, who knew good writing better than almost anyone alive, judged it the finest work of its kind since Caesar's Commentaries. Time proved Twain right. More than a century later, the book is still read, still praised, still in print, long after the newspapers that called Grant a butcher and a drunkard have crumbled into dust. The dying man had written the one thing his enemies could never take from him. When Grant died, the nation mourned as it had mourned few men. His funeral procession in New York was among the largest the country had ever seen, more than 1 million people lining the streets. And among the men who walked beside his coffin as pallbearers were generals of both armies, Union commanders he had led, and Confederate generals he had fought, including Simon Bolivar Buckner, the very officer who had handed him Fort Donelson and the words "Unconditional Surrender" 23 years before. In death, the man had drawn the blue and the gray to walk together. Look at him one last time. The most famous image of him is a forgery. The legends branded him a drunkard and a butcher. He failed in business again and again, and he died bankrupt and in agony, writing to the last. And yet this endlessly underestimated man won the greatest war in his nation's history, offered his beaten enemy mercy in place of vengeance, broke the Ku Klux Klan with the full power of the state, and in his final ravaged months produced a book that has outlived every insult ever thrown at his name. The gap between the image of Ulysses Grant and the record of what he actually did is the truest measure of the man. The country misjudged him again and again. He was never quite what the picture showed.